So hi, welcome everybody. It's really wonderful to see so many friends and colleagues here. As you hopefully know, we're here to celebrate Ben McKean's new book. Ben, say hi.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming.
Ben's an associate professor in the political science department at The Ohio State University. He's a political theorist whose work focuses on questions of global justice, populism, and the relationship between theory and practice. And we're here to talk about his new book, Disorienting Neoliberalism, Global Justice, and the Outer Limit of Freedom, whose handsome cover he can display for you now. I'm putting in the chat a link to the Oxford University Press site where you can order your copy of the book. And there is also a special discount code where you can get 30% off. So I would take advantage and order extra copies for display. We're really lucky to have as a guest with us, Lisa Ellis. Lisa's a professor of philosophy and politics and the director of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program at the University of Otago. She's an environmental political theorist and a recovering Kant scholar, her description. Her latest work is a critique of aviation exceptionalism, which appeared this year in a Routledge volume called Climate Justice and Non-State Actors. She's also one of 3 incoming co-editors at Political Theory, the journal. Her term officially starts on January 1st, but apparently everything submitted after the end of the month will go to the new editorial team. So if you're a political theorist listening, you should send her your work. If you submitted or read the Journal of Politics during the time when Lisa was the field editor there, you know that this is great news for our subfield that she's taking on this new position. I'm going to turn things over now to Ben, who will introduce his book to you. And after that, Lisa will offer some comments. This part of the panel will run for about 25 minutes, and then we'll take another 25 to 30 minutes for questions before letting Ben and Lisa wrap up. Once we get to the Q&A portion, you can either raise your hand to be recognized, your real hand if your video is on, or your blue Zoom hand. You can also pose questions in the chat stream, and that is a good place to leave your fan mail as well. So Ben, over to you.
Well, thank you so much to Emma and to Lisa for helping put this event together and participating, and thanks to everyone else for being here as well. It really does feel a little bit like an academic bar mitzvah or something to have so many friends and family and colleagues here. I did just receive the book today, so I'm happy to be able to share a physical copy with you, including this handsome cover by the comic artist Michael Kupperman. So I want to talk a little bit about the book just to introduce it because since it's just out now, you probably haven't read it. And so what I'd like to talk about at first is just the fact that start from the title, right? Neoliberalism is disorienting, right? We live in a world with a global economy that has been significantly structured by this political theory of neoliberalism. And it's a very strange world. We live in a world where 80% of global trade is now connected in transnational supply chains, which means I was just looking on the Walmart website the other day. They're selling t-shirts here in Columbus for $2 that are made halfway around the world in Jordan, right? I mean, how is that sustainable on that kind of a profit margin? Both sustainable for the people involved in that kind of a supply chain, and how is that sustainable environmentally? So the book begins by talking about some of the ordinary violence and the ordinary injustice that's contained in these global supply chains. So I start in particular by talking about a factory fire at a factory in Dhaka, Bangladesh, called Tazreen Fashions, which happened in December of 2012. And it killed 125 workers making clothes for Walmart and Disney. And it made global news for about 6 weeks. And then shortly thereafter, it was overtaken by an even greater injustice, the collapse of the garment factories at Rana Plaza, also in Dhaka, which killed 10 times more people. More than 1,100 people were killed. Again, making clothes for global companies like Benetton and Primark. So on the one end of the supply chain, we have injustices like that. On the other end of these global supply chains, where we're consumers and we can buy things, we also see neoliberalism structuring our lives and structuring our institutions in other kinds of ways. So now in the United States, we live in a country that has been growing more and more unequal for 50 years, right? We're at a point now where 20 people have as much wealth as the poorest 150 million Americans. So as workers, our situation has gotten more precarious. And as consumers, we're relentlessly surveilled, right? When we go into these stores, our phones often tell the companies we're there. These companies track all of the things we do on the internet in order to try and better manipulate our behavior and try and get us to be good consumers. There's a bunch of sort of anecdotes in the book to illustrate this. I think one of the most remarkable was one that made quite a splash in the New York Times Magazine when it happened, which was a father going into the local Target complaining that his daughter had gotten a book of coupons for baby stuff, and why were they sending coupons for baby stuff to his teenage daughter when she was just a kid, blah, 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 only to have the father allegedly return a couple weeks later to apologize to his chagrin to the manager, saying in fact Target had figured out from her web browsing that his daughter was pregnant before he had known, right? And so as a result of this, Target now says they actually give us irrelevant coupons on purpose because they know so much about us and they don't want us to realize that. So we live in this very strange world where we are surveilled, workers are surveilled. Some people benefit significantly. Others of us, benefit in some ways from these kinds of arrangements, but are disadvantaged in other ways. And so part of the question is, well, how should we think about this kind of world? How can we reorient ourselves to a world of neoliberalism when neoliberalism itself partly thrives on the fact that it's constantly churning, constantly changing, and constantly making it hard for us to get a grip on it? So in the book, I say that there are three components to having an effective orientation to our world. Right? One is how existing circumstances are kind of understood, are generally understood and generally made to seem legitimate. Two is how things actually work, which can diverge from how they're usually understood to work. And then third, what values we should promote given the context of one and two, right? Given the way that things are usually understood and given the way they actually operate, and given the possible gap between them, how should we conceive of the values we want to promote? So part of what I want to suggest in the book, one of the starting points really for the book, is to say that trying to promote these values on their own isn't enough. So I give a story in the introduction looking at an op-ed that Ted Cruz wrote in the Washington Post after Barack Obama defeated Mitt Romney, where Cruz, trying to adapt himself to what he thought would be politically effective, used the John Rawls and his idea of a difference principle, the idea that any kind of differences need to in our resources need to be justified to those people who are worst off. And he used this difference principle, this egalitarian value, to justify Ted Cruz's own kind of far-right Republican platform. And so part of what I take that to show is that values on their own can be politically multivalent. They can be used for lots of different purposes. And so what a political theory needs to offer is a way of connecting those values to our circumstances. And in a way of doing that, that can actually help us promote those values, which means in some cases, resisting the way things are ordinarily understood and not just reinforcing them, which often we can risk doing, right? And so that's particularly the case with the value of freedom. Freedom, understood in a particular way, is at the heart of neoliberalism, as I describe in the book. It offers a very particular vision of what it means to be a free person and what political institutions should look like to reflect that vision of freedom. So if those of us who are egalitarian and want to promote equality, that want to promote social justice, and want to promote, we can't simply invoke freedom and say like, that's why we're doing this, because neoliberalism already has a particular way of articulating that value. We need to articulate a different way of understanding that value. So in the book, what I do is first, I introduce and I sort of explain my understanding of neoliberalism as a political theory that has a specific understanding of freedom and uses that to justify making the market, making efficient markets really the highest possible aim of human society, and subordinating other things to that end. Now, there are some internal inconsistencies in that theory that I trace in the book that I think offer some opportunities for us. And I connect those to the actual practice of global trade by looking specifically at these transnational supply chains and how they work, and understanding them really as a form of political power that contains claims to authority and legitimacy that once we recognize them for what they are, we can more effectively contest. And part of doing that, I suggest, is coming up with a new vision of freedom that can help us resist these neoliberal institutions. And so in the book, I propose drawing this new vision of freedom from a range of theoretical sources. Part of the idea is that this new vision of freedom should be attractive to people from lots of different theoretical perspectives. And so I draw not just from sort of from canonical liberal thinkers like John Rawls, but also from Hegel, from W.E.B. Du Bois, from Gloria Anzaldúa, from Theodor Adorno, to show a range of theoretical perspectives that can endorse this more social vision of freedom. Now, it's not easy to, so part of the book involves giving some specific readings of these figures. There's a chapter on Hegel and Rawls, a chapter looking in more detail at how that work envisions a certain set of ideal circumstances that we don't enjoy. And so we need to think about how to adapt that value to a world that's full of injustice. And it's there that I turn to Du Bois, Anzaldúa, and Adorno as a guide to show how we can look at this, what Rawls calls the outer limit of our freedom, and how it can be a critical guide to our actions today to resisting injustice, even though we'll never be able to fully experience that kind of freedom. I sort of bring all this together in the chapter of the book that talks about the importance of solidarity along supply chains as a way of promoting social justice today. And then I, in the end, also look at other more national focused ways of trying to resist neoliberalism and argue that these national focused ways of promoting sovereignty against neoliberalism are likely to backfire in the ways in which they don't help us understand the particular way that politics and economics are imbricated together today. And then in the conclusion, I talk about why I think a disposition to solidarity is a viable way of being in the world right now. I compare it to some of the sort of reactionary dispositions that are associated with right-wing nationalism, with right-wing populism like Trump. I also compare it to humanitarian sympathy as another way of approaching these issues, and why I think solidarity is going to be a more effective approach. And I also talk about these transnational social movements, why we might actually want to get involved in them, how we can see our involvement, how we can see the practice of these forms of transnational organizing as itself an expression of our freedom, maybe one of the best forms of freedom, the best expressions of our freedom that we have available today. So just by way of summary then, what I think part of what the book offers to academics is there's a new way of doing global justice theorizing. It's not just taking ideas that we have from domestic institutions and seeing if we can transport them elsewhere. It's really a new way of thinking about, it's not entirely new, obviously, but it's a way of thinking about doing political theory that is itself, understands itself as a political practice, understands that it matters what kind of circumstances we find ourselves in to the kind of theory that we want to do. And then for non-academics, for activists and others who are concerned about global injustices like the Tazreen Fashions fire and the Rana Plaza collapse, or who are concerned about inequality in the US, right? Hopefully the book offers a useful explanation of how things came to be this way, how to think about their own struggles and connections with others, and why actually taking action to do something about the things that they already care about could itself be a practice of freedom, an expression of their freedom. So I think that's probably a long enough gloss of the book. Hopefully it hit on enough things that it'll give us some stuff to talk about. And now I'm really delighted to turn it over to Lisa to talk a little bit about her thoughts on the book.
Thanks, Ben. And thank you so much for writing this book. I think it probably is clear to everybody who has been here for the past few minutes. But this is a turgidity-free book. This is a really addictive book. I've read it cover to cover twice now and dipped into it a bunch. And as I was saying to Ben earlier this week, the second reading revealed to me just how I've sort of unconsciously assimilated a lot of the arguments. And one of the reasons that that happened to me is that the students are sort of pulling these arguments out of me. Students really want to hear about political practice that doesn't say to them, oh, evaluate the justice of institutions against this defensible normative theory, and then vote or wait until the existing representative structures convey your will to the top. Right? We could say a lot about that model, but the only thing I'll say about it right now is that it's not attractive to students who find themselves thrown into a world which they cannot affirm. So I'm warning everyone right now, this book is addictive, so be careful. It will affect your teaching. The piece of good news I can add to that, this news comes relatively late in the book, and I'm just going to preview it. Maybe it was strategic that this news comes late. So according to the author, you don't have to be a Hegel scholar to learn to orient yourself in this positive way. Yes, that's a relief. Maybe a little preview of that earlier might have been nice. But the truth is, the Hegel and Rawls lessons go down really smoothly. There are jokes throughout the book. I actually kept track, and there are fewer jokes in the Hegel and Rawls chapter than any other chapter. I think that's an interesting thing for you to contemplate why that is. But even so, the picture that we get, the Rawls there, is the sort of repressed Rawls, the institutional Rawls that we are used to teaching our students is just such an etiolated version. You don't mention this in the book, but it actually reminded me of the retrieval of the early, really quite religious Rawls, who's concerned deeply with problems like reconciliation. And of all the many cool things you say about Rawls, I think the thing I loved best was the reading of Rawlsian thought experiment as a kind of practice of orientation that should alter the way people think of themselves in relation to society and others. That was super cool. So another really good message that this one occurs relatively early on in the book is that your orientation towards solidarity, when you offer and listen, you listen to others' calls for solidarity, you offer your own solidarity. This is based not on humanitarian compassion, not on common national membership, not on resentment. I must admit, resentment is something that I find very tempting, but that aside, not on resentment. This is based on your actual interest, your interest in pursuing this kind of the outer limits of freedom, this kind of social freedom, this more substantial freedom. So I'm going to take that as carte blanche to be entirely self-interested in the rest of the things I say. My personal interest will be on display in the next few minutes, and I have an excuse for that because apparently that's all right. Yay. As I've already said, the sort of Hegel, Rawls, Du Bois mashup is super useful, not only for you guys as thinkers, but for you guys as teachers. If you think about your students, especially your students who come to you with a sincere desire to make the world a better place. I suppose a few of my students are still really sort of relentlessly pursuing material goods. Some of them may have signed up for these flights to nowhere. The vast majority of my students are oriented toward the righting the wrongs they see all around them, and especially the ones that they see as related to their embeddedness in the economy. They feel like they can't turn in any direction without doing a wrong, and it ruins them and it's paralyzing them. And they turn to nihilism because they worry about the futility of any kind of action in this sort of perfect neoliberal world that they find themselves thrown into. And the only neoliberal argument they buy is the one that says, well, if you've made any consumer choices that are based on fossil fuel consumption, then you must endorse the entire, automobility and fossil fuel based economy. So when my students get this McKeanian lesson, they are really happy and it is empowering. I cannot tell you how many times students have come up to me and said that was the most important thing they heard in Politics 307. Just to take one example of a student My student Claudia Palmer has always been an anti-oil extraction activist because the irrationality of it drives her crazy. But she was plagued by self-accusations of hypocrisy. And when she realized that she could have a different attitude toward her own behavior and toward the past that constructed her, and that, occasionally having to use the system that is the only available system didn't make her somebody who endorsed that system. That might not seem like rocket science to us, but that was extremely empowering to Claudia. And I'll report actually that she now is part of 350.org, and New Zealand last year banned new oil and gas exploration. It's not accidental. Right? We can draw these lines. So I find that part just really important for my teaching and occasional environmental activism and all of that. Another message that I've been giving the students that comes from this work is that the organizing that is necessary to make the world and your own existence in it more palatable and more of a reflection of your idea about what's good, it has to be fun. It can't just be some sort of, dry work where you empty yourself out for an external public good. That doesn't even rightly reflect your relation in it. So we talk a lot about joyful, open, connecting activism. Claudia herself certainly exemplifies this with her work on divestment, which was incredibly creative, using bodies in a way that I had not anticipated. So in the spirit of fun, I just wanted to read you my favorite joke from the book. It's hard out of context. There are so many to choose from, but here's my favorite one. Ben says, really existing neoliberalism does not generally resemble a frictionless series of mutually beneficial exchanges. So there's this on every page. Okay, I said I was going to be interested, and I am very self-interested, as so many of us are. And one of the things I really love about the book is the way it solves the problem for me. So when I talk about environmental politics and sustainability and things like the unsustainable aviation industry that we've given a free pass to. Incidentally, most people don't know that jet fuel for international flights is untaxed. I'm just putting it out there in case you didn't know that. People are frequently saying, well, everybody loves flying. And the we that even the best scholars refer to is the we of their tiny bubble. Right? This book orients us to the real we, and not just the we that we have sort of Singer-style humanitarian concern for, the we with whom we are deeply embedded, right? Everything I'm wearing, as Ben repeatedly tells us, I'm wearing on my back my relationships to the most disadvantaged. And if you can take into account this real we with which we're always already engaged, then you don't have to be such a pessimist about democracy. I just love the stuff you said, Ben, in the book about many positive things about Wendy Brown and David Harvey, but you did not endorse their pessimism about democracy for that reason. I thought that was really wise. So I wanted to talk just a tiny bit about the applicability of the three-step model, which I think everyone should sort of memorize and use. It's a lovely lens to understand what are otherwise really alienating dynamics. So here's a simple example: fruit picking in New Zealand. So in New Zealand, we live and die on agricultural export. And the local consumers are always complaining that we pay export level prices because there's no interfering with prices. There's no subsidies for domestic consumption. So we pay export level prices for really third-rate fruit because all our best fruit goes overseas. Well, we never asked ourselves how that fruit got picked. Nobody was surprised that the children of people who live in the cities aren't going fruit picking. And in fact, the fruits were being picked by people from Vanuatu, who on their own dime fly in every year, live in some of the most expensive places in New Zealand, get paid piece rates. And I don't know how they make it work, but somehow they do. So the pandemic hit, and the people from Vanuatu can't get in, and their cherries are rotting on the trees as we speak. And if you look at the dynamic in the discourse, The first impulse of New Zealanders was to say, oh, the benefit is too high. People from the cities should have a lower benefit so they would be forced to go out there and pick our fruit. But that perspective has been overwhelmed by a more McKeanian perspective, thank goodness. People are saying, look, let's consider the circumstances in which fruit picking is possible. And let's consider the disadvantage on which our entire economic model for fruit picking has been constructed. And I would not be surprised if after a season of rotten fruit, which is what we're in the middle of, we build something more sustainable. So I hope that we get to talk about the beauty of the critique of the global justice literature. It's just, if you've consumed it even a little, you will have noticed how unseemly it is. I do a bunch of very privileged professors sitting around talking about how little the global north owes the disadvantaged. Just how much do we have to pay to get what Robert Gooden would have called an environmental indulgence, just so our soul can be pure. Ben is very clear that that can't be the goal for us. I also hope we talk a little bit about orientations toward time. That was one of the spin-offs that this book, we should write lots more about that. This critique of the neoliberal orientation toward an uncertain future is a bad game, and the advocacy that what we need to do is try at least partly to be able to be at home in our skins by recognizing the system of injustice in which we're embedded and that made us, the Du Bois part of it. It's just beautiful. So I just want to conclude by reading a passage from a down south colleague of mine, political theorist Christine Winters, who works at the University of Sydney, and she does political theory from a Maori perspective. And here's Christine's version of time, which I think resonates just beautifully with Ben's. She writes, and she's doing a whakapapa, so a description of her orientation. It maps almost perfectly onto this book. So she says, consider for a moment this possible spiral. I have ancestors. I live now, and I have children who will, all being equal, continue to live when I am gone, and I will have grandchildren, all things equal, and so on. While I am living, I am also a potential ancestor, and my living children a future generation to me, as are my potential grandchildren, as was I to my ancestors. In time, I will be an ancestor, as will my children and grandchildren, and we will be living and accounting for future generations. The generations are coexisting. The past is always in the present, and the future is always in the past. So Christine is arguing for an indigenous perspective of time as a spiral against Western liberalism. I really think the resonances between this, deeply Western theory that we're engaged with today and its vision of time, the resonances with the more nonlinear, non-progressive indigenous vision of time are something I hope we discuss. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Lisa, for such a beautiful introduction to the book. At this point, the queue is open for questions. So if anyone has a question they would like to ask Ben, I would encourage you to raise your hand. Ben, while people get started, feel free to respond to anything in what Lisa just said that you'd like to as well.
Well, first, I just want to thank you, Lisa, for those wonderful comments. And it's obviously, for me, great to hear about how productive the engagement with the book has been, but I also think that the extensions that you offer are hugely illuminating. To talk about the extensions into the environmental issues, I think is really important, and it's something that the book itself doesn't do. But when we think about grounds for solidarity, I think it should be obvious that environmental destruction and climate change is a key area of injustice where we need transnational solidarity very badly. And I'm tempted to say in itself that's almost enough to sort of point the way towards the insufficiency of any kind of national level solution about neoliberalism. But I also want to talk a little bit about the point you made at the end, just to connect the point you made about temporality to the point you were making about people feeling like people not knowing what to do about the fact that we are implicated in these systems. And I think that really goes to the reading I give of Du Bois's view of progress in chapter 4, where Du Bois offers this idea that the only thing that we can get is ugly progress, in effect, that we shouldn't be scared of the fact that when we're trying to work for justice, when we're trying to make things better, there will be injustices that we reproduce. And I talk about some of the ways where Du Bois himself did that, the various ways in which hierarchy is reinforced in parts of souls, the souls of Black folk. But the way in which, that doesn't mean we should be a nihilist and give up on trying to get better, but just we should actually, as you suggest some people have, take some solace in the fact that all progress will be imperfect. And we shouldn't let that discourage us, that in fact there can be freedom that's won from the recognition of that ugliness and the way that it shapes us. And so I do think that that's connected to temporality, that that neoliberalism both wants us to always move quickly, but it also sort of orients us to a future that we never get to. Whenever there's any kind of problems, it always just says, well, we just need to let the efficient markets do its work and we'll get there. But it's a way of sort of always being in progress and oriented towards the future necessarily. And of course, that's reinforced by the precarious economic circumstances many people find themselves in. So they have to be in a certain way future oriented. And so part of what the book suggests is that a social kind of freedom needs to look at time in a different way, right? That it needs to, I sort of suggest that it involves a certain kind of looking backwards. But I think you're right to point out that there are lots of different possible kind of emancipatory temporalities, lots of ways of engaging with time that we can experience as freeing, and that could help us resist neoliberalism. So just thank you again for those comments. And I'll turn it back to Emma if there's a cue.
Yeah, so Noah in the chat asks a question that I'm sure others have too, which is just to invite you to say more about solidarity and what that looks like here as an alternative orientation.
Yeah, so as Lisa pointed out, I have a view of solidarity that is that it's interest based, right? That I sort of say it isn't a kind of cosmopolitan solidarity that all human beings qua humans have, but to say, look, we live in a world where many people have an interest in things being otherwise. There are ways in which I obviously benefit in many ways from our present circumstances, but there are also ways that are in which it's profoundly constraining to live amid injustice. And so, Du Bois talks about the way that whiteness warps people's character, that the privileges that are afforded in a hierarchical society aren't good for you. And I take that quite seriously. And I think that that's also true of these other issues. And so I think that there is a ground then for people to say, even though many people, right, receive benefits from the way that the world's currently organized, right? And as I point out, including people like sweatshop workers, right? Lots of exploitation involves people receiving a benefit, but an insufficient one or an inadequate one, or one that's combined with other forms of injustice. So many different kinds of people receive some sorts of benefits from the way that we're the system that we have. The question is sort of, how can we build coalitions to actually change things? How can we change it, right? And so what I say is we should be disposed to solidarity with others who also have an interest in resisting and replacing neoliberalism. So part of what that means is being attentive to calls for solidarity, that people will say, people do ask for support all the time, right? Part of how transnational social movements are structured by these calls, often structured by these calls for solidarity. And so part of what being disposed to solidarity entails is being ready to hear those calls, right? And being ready to perceive the people making those calls as equals, as having an equal political status as you, and being willing to treat them as partners in this effort to resist and replace neoliberalism. So the home case of the book is these supply chains. And so there's sort of the case studies are often about workers and consumers in the United States acting in solidarity with workers and consumers in Bangladesh and China, because those are some key examples of the apparel and electronics supply chains. But the idea of being ready to respond to a call to solidarity isn't limited to supply chains, but I think it's one place where, just because of the structure of our relations to each other, it can be especially easy to hear the call to solidarity.
Does this also require distinguishing between good and bad impulses of sympathy or solidarity?
Right. So I think that one of there's lots of different visions of solidarity. Some, obviously, a lot of solidarity is, as it were, exclusively identity based. And so you can get solidarity among the people doing the injustice, right? I mean, and that's not the kind of solidarity that the book is obviously meant to support. And so part of the argument of the book is that solidarity is appropriate to people in some circumstances, but not others, right? Supply chain managers are different from those of us who are consumers. They're actually engaged in a position where they have some authority. And it would be inappropriate. It would be kind of gross for them to express solidarity with the workers that they claim authority over, right? What's required of them is something different than what's required of others. Perhaps it's simply that they stop doing an injustice, right? Perhaps there's no such thing as an ethical supply manager, right? And so then what they need to do is they need to stop doing harm, or other people may be in a position again where they may not be responsible for the injustice, but they may benefit so much from our present circumstances that, again, solidarity may seem out of place, and what might be appropriate is something more like a kind of noblesse oblige or something, right? Something where it would be ridiculous for someone whose circumstances are as radically different from the rest of the world as Bill Gates to proclaim himself in solidarity with people, right? This is not moral advice that's universally applicable. It really is a book that's aimed at people who are in circumstances where they have an interest in changing things. And obviously that's not true of everyone in the world that they share that interest.
Another question from the chat, David says, when you describe neoliberalism as disorienting, it hits his ear similarly to the more familiar observation that neoliberalism is alienating. And could you say a little bit to distinguish between these two kinds of observation or complaint about neoliberalism?
Yeah, so there's a couple places where the book addresses the relevance of something like a Marxist account of alienation to our present circumstances. So one is that one of the things that's kind of familiar from the home case of Marxist alienation is part of what's alienating is that we're being, in effect, told a kind of lie. We're told we live in a world where there's equality. Ideology helps maintain that world, and we're alienated from the labor process, but we don't even always realize our alienation because of this kind of fiction that's maintained about the difference between political equality and economic equality. And one thing that's true about neoliberalism is it's an ideology of a different kind. It doesn't pretend that politics and economics are separate. It just says politics is at the service of economics. And so in that way, it embraces a kind of alienation and sort of says, what the way in which things are should serve the market. And if you don't like it, you're kind of mistaken about how things ought to be. It's not in that sense telling us, get us to buy a fantasy about how wonderful our freedom is. It's just telling us what freedom is making choices in the market. And if you don't like that, tough. You're probably not going to do very well in a fully kind of neoliberal society. But the other point of contact here is Marx's account of commodity fetishism, where I do think that that's obviously in some ways relevant for understanding the experience of being disoriented by supply chains. And so I talk about how uncanny this knowledge that we have is about the fact that these books, our clothes and our electronics have been touched by, thousands of hands all over the world, that our phones have components from 46 countries. I mean, it's just very hard to get a grasp upon. And part of, I think, what neoliberalism does is it tells a different story about that uncanniness. It turns it into a kind of theodicy, and it tells us that that's just the magic of the market, right? That's not you being alienated from the process of labor. That's really the miracle of markets. And so it provides a way of trying to understand or re-narrate that experience as something miraculous, rather than something alienating. And so it doesn't deny the experience, but it tries to change the valence of it, would be one way to put it.
Great. So there's a question, again, in the chat from Mara, thanking you both for the great comments, but also picking up on Lisa's comments about how college and university students pick up on these kinds of arguments. It said that college and university students are at least one group that's amply positioned both to think about and experience some of neoliberalism's excesses, both through what we teach and how they experience the convulsions around higher ed in the US. So would you like to say a little bit about how you engage these questions with your own students? And in your view, where does the university fit, both within neoliberalism and the disorienting disposition that you theorize?
There's a lot in that question. And one of the things that one of the things that I think would be a good extension of the book would be a more thoroughgoing kind of analysis of the neoliberal university. I mean, one of the things that I think we clearly see from students is they have grown up in a world in which the idea that college is about human capital just makes sense to them, right? That unlike previous generations, they've taken on a level of student debt that other people would have found unimaginable. And so in a very obvious way, it just makes sense. They have to think about college as an investment in a way that other people haven't had to. And so for that reason, I think that in some ways, they're very disposed to think about human capital. They're very disposed to these neoliberal ways of thinking because it's precisely the world that they've had to grow up in. On the other hand, I do think that they're very open to reorientation. And I do think part of what could facilitate that reorientation would be demystifying the university. I mean, I don't think students don't have any idea how the labor, about how universities work. They don't understand the tenure system. They don't know the difference between being taught, they don't always understand the difference between being taught by an adjunct and being taught by a full professor. And they don't understand why their tuition is going up, and they assume it's going often to faculty. Which it's not. And so I do think that in a lot of ways, sort of giving students an introduction to the economic realities of the institution that they're inhabiting is something they're disposed to think about because they've had to be trained to already think about college as an investment, but they haven't thought about, I think, the other side of the economics in the university. And I do think that there are ways we're trying to explain how higher education is transformed, how it's continuing to transform, could actually be a great case to present to students about why they would benefit from being reoriented. Of course, part of what doing that would require would require faculty themselves to be disposed to solidarity with students. And in my experience, that certainly isn't always the case. And so it would require, I think, many members of the faculty to also rethink their own position in that way.
We have an open queue at the moment if anyone else has questions to put in the chat or that they'd like to ask themselves. I don't need to keep a stranglehold on the question supply here.
So I can jump in while people are thinking. One of the things I was wondering about is the sort of lessons of the pandemic through this thinking. And they are so many. For example, and it would be great if you could talk about this a little, about the way you've basically got the last nail in the coffin for the consent model and a very coherent explanation of the Hegelian view of the state as it inheres in the attitudes of the people. We could hardly have a better example of the viability of that description vis-a-vis the coercive state description than we have in the post-pandemic response. I was also thinking about the lessons we've learned about supply chains, and maybe this is a hopeful thing. You were talking just now about the neoliberal university and how people really, it's a very Du Boisian point, right? People have to understand before they can be free. So the supply chains may have taught us some lessons about the fragility of these relationships. And I think we also have learned a lot about the way neoliberalism functions to hide things from us, just on every level. For example, um, electronic inequality was hidden until the pandemic struck largely. People could show up and present themselves as equal, and we now know that that was just wildly never true. So maybe you want to speculate a little bit on the sort of, if I were writing the, what I've learned from the pandemic.
Yeah, there was a point in, I don't know when it was, April maybe, when I worried that by the time the book finally came out, it would be dated, because it seemed like the US government, for example, was poised to massively move away from a kind of neoliberal austerity model and actually, for example, just spend a lot of money to cover people's payrolls so they would stay home and not get sick. That obviously didn't happen. And so, if anything, I think we've seen the resilience of a lot of these ways of thinking, and the intractability, the difficulty of overcoming some of these institutions without more widely organized and more widely supported opposition. I think when it comes to supply chains, you're right that their fragility has been exposed, and is kind of common knowledge in a way because of the pandemic, because of the fact that production of PPE and of pharmaceuticals, of vaccines, is a part of these supply chains, which were very easily disrupted. I think that exposed the way in which having supply chains that prioritize maximizing efficiency at all costs, that abhor the idea that there could be excess inventory anywhere, as an inefficiency that's antithetical to neoliberalism and to profits. I think that there could be a way of taking that up and showing people that this model is unsustainable. I think that I think that one way we could do that would be to show that there is a widespread and widely shared interest in reforming supply chains in a way that would be more just. What I do often see, though, is I see this fragility taken up as an excuse for nationalism, right? I see it often kind of national populist response that either demonizes China for being the place where many of the PPE is produced, or rather demonizes Chinese workers for being the kind of people who get low wages. And so that's led to the offshoring of production. And that's obviously not a very solidaristic approach. I also don't think it's a very effective one. I mean, many of the key components of a lot of our electronics and of our vaccines, our pharmaceuticals, I mean, a lot of these things aren't found in the US, right? All of our batteries need like lithium, they need all these kinds of things. And so what you see from the Trump administration isn't a real effort to bring these supply chains back on shore, but an opportunity to use the fragility of these supply chains as another excuse for why the US needs to completely dominate and control the world so that it can have access to the raw materials it needs for its supply chains. So I think it's important to think about resisting that, and also resisting the people who are calling for this as a reason to further neoliberalize. I've also seen many people in business and in supply chain management say, look, this is precisely why the fact of the pandemic shows why we need supply chains to be even more mobile, why we need supply chains to be even more kind of super exploitative and temporary in its engagement with workers so that they can move whenever there's a pandemic somewhere. That also obviously is a way of responding to that fragility in a way that only, I think, deepens problems. So I think that there's obvious ways in which having a global pandemic can and should be an opportunity for people to be in solidarity. The facts of epidemiology mean that we're all in this together in a pretty clear way. Not all of us. Obviously, some people have better access to healthcare and can, keep themselves off the front lines. But I've seen a lot of, I'd say, missed opportunities for solidarity so far in this year.
Maybe I'll ask a question about the biography of the book. To what extent do you think it was shaped by your own experience and activist practice? As you work on the relationship between theory and practice, I'm interested in how that plays out there.
Well, you will be happy to learn that that is dealt with in the conclusion of the book, which begins, here I'm showing you the conclusion, by saying that in developing my account of freedom, I've emphasized how our actions and attitudes are shaped by unjust circumstances, which they tend to reproduce. Mindful of that, I want to begin this concluding chapter by reflecting briefly on the circumstances that have shaped my own thinking in the field of argument that I'm contributing to. So I'm kind of tempted to break off there and say, like, if you want to hear more, you need to buy the book, but that's probably a little bit too mercenary. But I will just say that, yes, I mean, the experiences of transnational activism I've had have certainly shaped the book. And in particular, you know, I think I first learned about supply chains, and I first met workers in supply chains through United Students Against Sweatshops. And so certainly that was a key experience for me. And then going to grad school and reading global justice theory and finding things that were basically unrecognizable from my experience of the global justice movement from, you know, 99 to 2001 is certainly part of what motivated me to write the book.
Okay. In a similar vein, a mystery woman in the chat asks, as you wrote the book, what was the most surprising argument you found yourself making, or a resource you found surprisingly useful?
Boy, I feel like I'm not even in a position to be surprised by the book anymore. I feel like having gone over the proofs and then having like looked at it again, I think, I mean, I think that the thing that's most surprising to me about the book is, well, I mean, for me, it all makes sense together. And I'm very curious to see, as the book is sort of taken up, how people want to tease it apart, because it's not obvious that some of these thinkers should go together. It's not obvious that you would read Hegel and Rawls with Du Bois and Zaldua and Adorno. And so I'm curious to see how much people find the conjunction of those thinkers useful and how much they find it distracting or unpersuasive.
That half answers the last question in the chat, which is which other thinkers do you engage with in the book? You've mentioned a few now, but Jeremy also asks how much you engage the question of what freedom is, how much of the book that occupies, or whether it appears as more of a background to the argument.
I mean, I think it really is the central argument of chapters 3 and 4, where I first lay out this more social view of freedom that I draw from Rawls and from Hegel. But then I also show why their view is inadequate to our circumstances. We're denied the experience of freedom that they describe. And so we need to find other ways of articulating that value. And so part of that account is drawn from these other thinkers who foreground the experience of injustice. But I think that they are all drawing from the same framework, the same kind of framework of a social view of freedom at the outer limit. When you can experience yourself as accepting the institutions that have made you who you are.
I'm going to ask one last question from one of my best students, Jacob, who says, to go back to the university's role and demystifying the university experience for students, do you think some universities are better suited than others? For example, might a university like Ohio State that enjoys rabid school spirit have a harder time than a school with a less enthusiastic student body? Do you think programs like Free College could help build solidarity between faculty and students? I'm going to cut off the queue there as well and just invite you, Ben, to segue into any last remarks you'd like to make about the book, and also any final comments that Lisa has to offer.
So just in terms of that question, I do think that, so there's a group of people doing education organizing called Bargaining for the Common Good, and they're mostly focused on teachers' unions in public high schools, public high school and elementary schools, but they have also done some work with unionized university faculty at Rutgers and elsewhere, where the idea is faculty and students should be organizing together to resist the impoverishment of higher education that's taken place over the past generation, and that we do have a shared interest. So I don't think that something like, Ohio State school spirit doesn't need to be an obstacle to that. I think if anything, it could be repurposed into enthusiasm for, making Ohio State great again. But I think that, and I don't think it's a coincidence that so much of the right has tried to delegitimize higher education recently, precisely because it is a place where people do get reoriented, and where the experiences people have of the economy as it is can be reflected on more critically. And so I do think that for people who want to pursue their education, I do think that there's a lot of shared interests. I'll turn it over to Lisa now, since we only have a few more minutes, but maybe I'll save maybe a final thought for the end.
Oh, thanks. Those questions were really interesting. I'm so glad that we talked about these things. Just want to remind everyone that we haven't been able to do much more than scratch the surface today. We didn't talk about habit, which we'll get there, but that was such an important part of the book. And we didn't talk about all the little sort of useful gems that the perspective can help you make sense of things that have been bothering you in a way that's itchy, or you keep saying uncanny, and I like that description, but there's just some, we're not comfortable with the circumstances that we face. Think about how you feel when you click agree to the T&Cs, and the book will explain why you feel justly aggrieved. Think about how you feel about ethical audits, right, as a response to some real wrong. Those of you who are staff members at unis, when you're asked to do a video tutorial on respecting each other, how does that make you feel about promoting the value of mutual respect? And once you read the book, you'll understand why that's such a hideously inadequate response to a problem like injustice. So I hope everybody goes and reads it, because I'll have more people to talk to. It's super fun.
Well, I'll just say in closing, because we're right at 5, I just want to thank everyone again for coming, and thank Lisa for engaging with the book and for her comments today, and to thank Emma for moderating. In fact, the chapter on supply chains, I think I first presented when we were on a panel together at APT, so it's nice to come full circle here. So I hope that the book sounded interesting to you, and hopefully I'll have a chance to talk with you all about what's in it at some point. And if the hardcover price is too expensive, I'm reliably informed there will be a paperback. So I don't want to, this is, wrong life cannot be lived rightly. I do need to get my last bit of entrepreneurship in. But thank you all again. I really appreciate it.